So this lecture goes along with Chapter 24, The Origin of Species. So far we've covered how populations change over time and evolve over time, and we've looked at the evidence for evolution. Here what we're going to talk about is how do new species arise to begin with from those that already exist. And a cute little cartoon for you here. So Darwin, even in all of his work over 3 decades time and beyond, he never really tackled the idea of how new species arose. He did say that both in space and time we seem to be brought somewhere near to the great fact, that mystery of mysteries, that first appearance of new beings on this earth. So he recognized that this was something that he never addressed, but he still never addressed it. A couple of terms that aren't truly defined in this lecture that you need to make sure that you look up. I'll run through them, but you should look them up. They're in your condensed notes, and of course they'll be in your book. Are speciation, microevolution, and macroevolution. Speciation, which of course is the crux of this lecture, is the process by which new species arise. Then to contrast microevolution and macroevolution, microevolution is the change in the genetic makeup of a population from generation to generation. And really what we're talking about are adaptations that are confined to a single gene pool. And this is basically what we spend most of our time talking about, is microevolution. But don't forget about macroevolution. And these are evolutionary changes above the species level. A good example is the appearance of feathers, other really unique novelties. These are characteristics that are often used to define a higher taxonomical level or higher taxa. So those are some terms you need to make sure you know the difference of. So moving on. What's a species? There's a term called the biological species concept that you need to know, and it's really kind of what we refer to just as a species for short, but this was developed by Ernst Mayr. And he said that it's a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring, and who are reproductively compatible. So make sure you know this definition. It includes those 2 bullets. Let's take a look at these 2 meadowlarks, the eastern and western meadowlarks. They're distinct species, even though when you look at them phenotypically they're quite similar. Their songs and their behaviors are different enough to prevent interbreeding. And taking a look at these pictures of humans, now humans are so diverse, but of course we're one species, whereas the meadowlarks are so similar but considered different species. So just looks are not always enough to determine whether or not organisms are of the same species. Just consider dog breeds. So how do new species originate? Well, first of all, the most important idea is that the populations must become isolated in somehow or some way, either being geographically isolated or reproductively isolated. Because obviously if you're geographically isolated, you will become reproductively isolated. Populations that are isolated will evolve independently or separately from one another. There are 2 categories of isolation. Allopatric, which is geographic separation, and allopatric means other country. That might help you to keep these straight. And the other type of isolation is sympatric, where organisms still live in the same area, and that's also known as same country. When we look at these 2 pictures, and it kind of demonstrates the 2 different types of speciation, recall that there's another term that I want to make sure that you haven't lost in all of this, that when you have individuals beginning a new colony, if you will, often what can happen is something called adaptive radiation. That's another term you need to make sure you've got a real strong hold on. This is where many new species arise from one single common ancestor, same species. This usually happens when a few organisms make their way to a new or distant area, or when environmental changes cause numerous extinctions, therefore opening up several ecological niches for new species to arise. Let's look at some barriers that would prevent organisms from mating or from fertilization. There are pre- and post-reproduction barriers. Most isolating mechanisms prevent reproduction from happening to begin with. That would be most effective. Because if you spend all your time mating with, fertilizing, and reproducing with an organism and going ahead and producing an offspring, but then the offspring doesn't work out, that would be post-zygotic, then you've wasted a lot of energy and resources in doing so. So pre-reproduction barriers are obstacles to mating or fertilization if mating occurs. There's geographic isolation, here seeing a mountain range between two flowers. Ecological isolation, so you inhabit two different areas. Temporal isolation, when are you active, during what time of day? Behavioral isolation, do you recognize each other's courtship rituals or songs? Mechanical isolation, you literally don't fit together your reproductive parts. And gametic isolation, the gametes cannot fuse. So let's tackle each of these. First, geographic isolation. The physical barrier separating these two species of squirrels prevent them from reproducing. Now, these species used to be one and the same, but over time, the allopatric speciation took hold, and the Harris antelope squirrels that inhabit the canyon's south rim, this guy right here, is really just a few miles away from the very closely related white-tailed antelope squirrel. But because of their separation, and if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, it's a couple miles down, just one way, and then you have to go back up the other side. That's a lot of work for a little squirrel. And even though these might look like chipmunks to you, notice that there are no stripes on the face. That's how you know it's a chipmunk or a squirrel. So this is a great example of allopatric speciation, where there's a physical barrier that creates separation. Let's look at another type of isolation. Now this is ecological, where species occur in the same region but occupy different habitats, so they rarely encounter one another. So therefore they're reproductively isolated. For example, there are two species of garter snake that occur in the same area. One lives in the water and the other is terrestrial. Therefore they wouldn't really come into contact with one another. Now lions and tigers can hybridize, but if we leave them alone, they live in separate habitats. Lions in grasslands, tigers in the rainforest, and so they don't really come into contact with one another. But as many of you know, they have been hybridized by humans. We create ligers and tigans, but they're not always very reproductively successful. Now these would be examples of sympatric speciation, where they're actually in the same area, but they may be active in different portions of that habitat, so that they don't really come into contact. So that, therefore, it's sympatric speciation, because they're in the same country, if you will. Temporal isolation. This is where species that breed during different times of the day, different seasons, or even different years can't mix their gametes. This is an example of reproductive isolation and, of course, sympatric speciation. They're in the same country. For example, the eastern spotted skunk on the left and the western spotted skunk on the right, they overlap in their range, but the eastern, that's this guy here, mates in the late winter, and the western mates in the late summer. Did you know that we actually have spotted skunks in California? They're up, basically on the other side of the river, toward like El Dorado Hills, but up more north toward Tahoe, up the 50 corridor. Another type of isolation, behavioral. This is where unique behavioral patterns and rituals isolate species, and this helps to identify members of the species. Of course, your dance is going to attract mates of the same species. That means nothing. Your courtship rituals, your mating calls. If you don't recognize the mating calls or the courtship rituals, then this would be a form of reproductive isolation. A really good example are these great little birds called blue-footed boobies. They mate only after a courtship display that's unique to their species. There are many boobies, if you will, on the Galapagos Islands, and this is perhaps the most comedic species of those. They have a very funny little outfit and expression. Their name, in fact, is actually taken from the Spanish word bobo, which means clown. The blue-footed boobies above here display part of their little humorous courtship, whereby they raise their feet one at a time and then they swivel their heads away from their prospective mate looking at the sky. Other interesting booby features are the highly evolved airbag systems in their skulls. This allows them to dive bomb into the sea for a fish from a really, really high height, and the egg and hatching nesting boundaries that they make are actually rings of booby poop. That's nice. They aren't the only booby on the island, though. There are also the masked boobies and red-footed boobies around. Recognizing your own species. This is more examples of behavioral isolation. In Kenya, the gray-crowned cranes have a very elaborate and specific courtship display that they would only recognize as their own. Lacewings that live sympatrically, so they're in the same area. They have a very distinct call, if you will, that they produce by their wings. And these are basically the frequencies of their songs. You can see the time in seconds. And so these different species, this one you could imagine a very rapid, short chirping, almost like maybe a cricket. This is a little bit longer and even longer with more time in between. The altitude on this would produce a different volume as well. Fireflies have a very particular courtship display. And so these are ways that these organisms would recognize each other and then therefore choose to mate. Mechanical isolation. This may also be a form of sympatric speciation, where even though they live in the same area, their different structures keep them apart. There are morphological differences that can prevent successful mating, and this is a form of reproductive isolation. In plants, even in closely related species of plants, the flowers often have distinct appearances that attract different pollinators. So these two species, for example, of the monkey flower really differ in their shape and their color, and so therefore cross-pollination doesn't happen. But here's something really interesting that I'd like for you also to read up on in your book or your condensed notes, called autopolyploidy. Sometimes in plants, non-disjunction occurs where a 2N cell becomes a 4N cell, and of course this would end up being the gamete, and so your whole plant becomes 4N. So what you end up with is a whole plant that has a chromosome number 4N instead of 2N, and that 4N plant would not be able to breed with any of the 2Ns. And so you could end up, if this is a plant that can self-breed or self-fertilize, with a population of plants that are 4N, and that would be an example of sympatric speciation. Polyploidy speciation isn't that common in animals, but it's happened on a few occasions. Mechanical isolation for animals. We just looked at it for plants and how different plants can't be cross-pollinated because they attract different pollinators. This also happens in animals. For many insects, male and female sex organs of closely related species don't fit together, therefore the sperm cannot be transferred. This lack of fit between sexual organs is really kind of hard to imagine for us, but it's a really big issue for insects with differently shaped genitals. For example, that look at the different shapes of damselfly penises and how that would obviously only work with certain species. Here's a damselfly. So the selection here is so intense because it directly affects offspring production. It actually affects the sex itself. Gametic isolation. Here the sperm of one species might not be able to fertilize the eggs of another species. Another example is sympatric speciation. So how does this happen? There are biochemical barriers so that the sperm can't penetrate the egg, so that would prevent the fusion. So for example, the receptor recognition might not work. The lock and key between the egg and the sperm may not be compatible. Think about your acrosome reaction and your cortical reaction. Go back to that chapter for animals. Chemical incompatibility. If the sperm enter the female reproductive tract, it may not be able to survive that chemical environment within that female reproductive tract and die. Here's an example. Sea urchins release sperm and eggs into the surrounding waters. Obviously, they don't have physical sexual reproduction. They're relying on the sperm and the eggs bumping into each other in the water. So in the water, the sperm and egg would fuse to form zygotes, and gametes of different species, like red and purple urchin, can't fuse. They're not compatible. So those are some pre-zygotic reproduction barriers. And that word's not on here, but pre-zygotic and post-zygotic barriers are the terms that you need to know. So a post-reproduction barrier would prevent the hybrid offspring from developing into a viable fertile adult. So let's say that none of those pre-zygotic barriers worked or were in place, and two different species go ahead and reproduce. Here's a barrier that can prevent that from moving on. Now, sometimes, and most times, hybrids are not quite as good as the species from which they came. Here are the three problems that you definitely need to know, and we'll look at why this is true. What happens when species hybridize? Reduced hybrid viability, we'll talk about each one. Reduced hybrid fertility, and hybrid breakdown. That's silly. So let's take a look at each one. Reduced hybrid viability. So here genes of different parent species may interact and impair the hybrid's development. For example, species of the salamander genus Encetina, they may interbreed, but most of the hybrids don't complete development, and those that do are actually very frail and don't do very well. So reduced hybrid viability, they're just not as strong, which is a really basic way of saying it. Reduced hybrid fertility. Even if the hybrids are vigorous, meaning they're strong if you will, they might be sterile. The chromosomes of the parents may differ in their number or their structure, and meiosis in hybrids may fail to produce normal gametes. Classic example, horses, they have 64 chromosomes or 32 pair. Donkeys, 62 chromosomes or 31 pairs. They can reproduce together and make mules, which have 63 chromosomes. Anyone who's spent any time around horses know that mules are very vigorous. They're very, very strong, have great endurance, but they are sterile because when we look at how their chromosomes would try to pair up in meiosis, it wouldn't work. Gametes not viable. So those chromosomes can't pair up because of the odd number, and that's why mules are sterile. And the last is hybrid breakdown. So hybrids may be fertile and viable in the first generation, but when they mate, their offspring are feeble and sterile. So the initial hybrid may be okay, but then when you take those hybrids and breed them together, you get not much. For example, in strains of cultivated rice, hybrids are vigorous, but plants in the next generation are small and actually sterile. They're basically on the path to separate species. Now, how quickly does speciation occur? There's a debate going on to look at two different hypotheses. Does speciation happen gradually or rapidly? One idea is gradualism, and this was put forth by Darwin and Lyell, Charles and Charles. Punctuated Equilibrium has been supported by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge. Here you see Niles Eldredge. So let's take a look at each of these and which is true. In gradualism, the idea is that there's a gradual divergence over long spans of time, such that the big changes that we see are due to the accumulation of many, many, many small changes over long periods of time. So in the beginning, you might have had a species, but in the end, you have a couple that are very, very different, but this is due to very slight changes over vast amounts of time. Now with the punctuated equilibrium model, the rate of speciation is not so constant. So if we back up a second, you can see that this basically is assuming kind of a constant rate of change. So you can get rapid bursts of change and long periods of little or no change. So basically, species undergo rapid change when they first bed off from a parent population and then maybe undergo no change or little change over long periods of time. So punctuated equilibrium has long periods of stasis followed by periods of punctuation where you have lots of speciation events, and then more static, if you will, and then so on. So, does speciation happen gradually or rapidly? Here's your gradualism, punctuated equilibrium. Charles Darwin, Charles Lyell supported the gradualism model. Stephen Jay Gould, Niles Eldredge support the punctuated equilibrium model. Gradualism says that there's a gradual accumulation of small changes over long periods of time. Punctuated equilibrium says that rapid bursts of change are mixed with long periods of little to no change. So really what we see in the fossil record, the take-home message, is we actually see both. When we see rapidly changing environments, or maybe not rapidly, but big changes in the environment, we tend to see punctuated equilibrium. And when there's very little change or slow changes in the environment, we might see gradualism. So we do see both in the fossil record. Stephen Jay Gould is definitely worth his own slide or 2 or 10. He was a Harvard paleontologist and an evolutionary biologist, a very, very prolific author. Here are his books, some of them anyway. And he really popularized evolutionary thought. He studied, he was an evolutionary biologist, he was a historian of science, he was very influential and a wide-read writer of popular science of his generation. He served as a member of the faculty at Harvard, beginning way back in 1967. Toward the end of his life, he actually served as the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology at that university, and he helped Niles Eldredge developed the theory of punctuated equilibrium in 1972. According to Gould, this idea of punctuated equilibrium overthrew the key tenet of neo-Darwinism, according to most evolutionary biologists. The theory was an important insight, but merely modified neo-Darwinism in a way that fully was compatible with what had been known before. Gould became known through his popular science essays in Natural History magazine. He was an emphatic advocate of evolution and wrote prolifically on the subject, trying to communicate his understanding of contemporary evolutionary theory to a wide audience, trying to get out to everybody, not just people that really were into science. A recurring theme in his writings is the history and development of evolutionary and pre-evolutionary thinking. His early research involved the study of the fossil record of snails, and detailed in one of his essays. And he was also an enthusiastic baseball fan and made frequent references to the sport, including an entire essay, and a very wide range of other topics. He even was featured on a Simpsons episode. Okay, to finish this off here. It's very, very important that you remember that evolution is not goal-oriented, even though we may see trends in the fossil record, especially if you look at horses. That doesn't mean that evolution is goal-oriented. It doesn't mean that just because we see this trend, that this was the ultimate goal, that this was the animal that was going to be produced in the end. Surviving species don't necessarily represent the peak of perfection. There are always compromises and random chances that are involved as well. So you might think about evolution not being survival of the fittest, rather just the survival of the just good enough. Remember, that's for humans as well. And a couple of thoughts to leave you with. Okay, you've gotten your notes done, and you'll have some review questions in class to answer from here.